Hello, everyone. Welcome to a conversation about respect. Today, I'm delighted to have Hardeep Kaur with me. I got very excited about her background in transformation and change, and she'll introduce herself in a moment. But I got very curious about how many opportunities she's had to look at this topic of respect in the workplace. So, Hardeep, please introduce yourself to everyone.
All right. Thank you, Bobby. Thank you for welcoming me to your podcast, and I'm very happy and delighted to be here. And just by introduction, I've been in pharma for about 30 years, mainly started in the manufacturing space, and currently working on transformation across the organizations, transformation and particularly change leadership and change management.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So, Hardeep, I ask everybody when we open up, and then from here we'll go anywhere. But how do you define respect? What does respect mean for you?
Sure, and I think that's it's a quite broad definition, I would say, right? It's something that people sort of have this concept even outside of work, and they bring that into the workplace. So, for me, particularly if you're looking at a business setting and workplace, it's mostly valuing others' contributions, right? It's treating people with dignity. It's listening actively. It's really encouraging that collaboration. So it's that mutual understanding of like respect, right? Whatever the other person in front of you, your colleague has to say, it carries that value. It really builds that trust. So I would say in workplace, respect and trust are intertwined very, very closely.
Yeah. Say more about that. Like, does one come before the other? And is there a progression in how we work with those two, respect and trust?
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting question because, when I look at workplaces, like every single person is very competent, right? Hence they're in the role. So with competency comes that aspect of I know my work. So if somebody is coming across, I know my work, I know my job, then you have to by default have the trust in their capabilities. Right. So if you trust their capabilities, then you're connected to, okay, we understand what they're saying. So you have to intently listen in. And in workplaces, it shows up in many ways because you're either there to solve a business problem, or you're trying to collaborate to innovate, or you're trying to pull a strategy together, or really trying to understand, the sort of the landscape and what is happening with the business. So in all of those aspects, I feel like trust is important because you have to listen, right, and collaborate with others to get to the solution you're looking for. So I would say what comes together, I think it's not an and or, it is actually or, right? Like it has to be together. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. Thank you. Let's see. So, yeah, how do you know when you're in a space where there's respect, be it one-on-one or interpersonal or with a group, a team?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I worked in, luckily, I've been, blessed with most of my work environment has been extremely respectful, right? So, when I say that, to me, it is the team environment that it creates. It is, you are listening to each other, you are more open to each other's ideas, you're collaborating more, it creates that culture where you feel safe to speak up because you're respected and your ideas are welcomed. So, if I again kind of look into the workplaces, it's very much tied to team's performance. A team that really operates from the lens of trust and lens of listening to each other is extremely high performing, and they can deliver value much faster than where you have this toxic environment of lack of trust and lack of respect. So both again, trust and respect are intertwined very, very closely. And I think it's one of those things like, sometimes it's hard to pinpoint, but you feel it. Like like it's like culture. Like you can't really describe it, but when the culture is not right. I feel the respect isn't around the same type of environment. It's like the software of the organization.
Wow. The software of the organization. I love that. Yeah, that's great. Um, so let's go another layer from there. Hardeep, how about I'm curious. So there is that feeling safe. So there's safe space for people to speak up. What about when there's disagreement? Do you feel that that does surface and is also handled respectfully? Or often what I find, I actually think, especially in America, I can't say globally, but in America, I think we have a bit of a passive aggressive syndrome in many corporations where there's a surface level kindness, but people aren't speaking their truth. And it can show up through their actions in how they say one thing or don't say something
Mm.
and then do something else, especially when there isn't alignment on business goals between two departments, two executives. Yeah, I'm wondering if you've had experiences with that and how you've navigated that.
Sure, and that happens in every healthy organization, right? You have to have disagreements to actually come up with a better solution. Because can you imagine if everyone agreed to yes, yes, yes. And you may get a suboptimal solution. But I think I want to maybe connect it back to my software comment. So, in an organization, I see the systems and the processes and the structure as hardware, and I see the culture and the people as software. So to me, if you want to have a healthy culture, it needs to be a balance of both. But coming back to your misalignment, misagreements, I think it's also creating that safe space in projects. So if I'm leading a change, for example, I know that there will be people who will have a different opinion. So if I go with that notion from the very beginning that I need to understand different perspectives to have a better solution, that's okay. So to me, it's a mental preparedness, right? No matter how much you prepare, you'll still get some passive aggressive behaviors because that's how humans are. You see that at work, you see that outside work. The idea is really how do you proactively be prepared and manage that and not necessarily let that get to you, right? Because if exists in the workplaces, you just have to figure out how to tackle through it. Being respectful and to me, really understanding where that resistance is actually coming from. Because most of the time, if you really sort of start to unravel and seek to understand, it's bigger than resistance, right? It's bigger than just what it's showing up. And I also, in the change space, I see resistance as data, right? It's a data point for me to actually now figure out what is actually going on. So then it gives me a little bit more, let me dig deeper and what is the actual antecedent of that resistance. So, I don't see that as negatively. I kind of perceive that more of like, oh, here's another opportunity to really solve the business problem in a different manner. So,
Yep. Yeah, no, I'm hearing openness for curiosity, growth mindset. Thank you, Carol Dweck, right? And yeah, and often I feel that I have to catch myself, especially when I have that tendency to really feel that urge to really be forceful with my perspective, to use that as an indicator, because that's another form of resistance, right? I'm having resistance to another's point of view.
yeah.
And do I go directly to making my point, or do I really slow down, take a breath, and really ask questions? Because I do believe all of good leaders should be coaches. So do I ask those open-ended inquiry questions to seek to understand versus wanting to be understood?
Yeah. And I'll give you an example, right? So to me, a leader shows up as a thermostat or a thermometer. So I say that because if I am just a thermometer, I'll just go in, read the room, and react to that room. And at that point, you have to make a decision of your emotional awareness, right? And be a thermo stat where you can regulate because you have so much power in that moment to change the dynamics of the room. So all of this, a leader has this huge responsibility to set the tone, right? To set the dynamics of the room. And I feel like, what can I do at that moment to be a thermostat versus just a thermometer? So that I use that analogy, but it has worked for me a lot. Yeah.
That's a quotable. Absolutely. Yeah, I like that thermostat. Yeah. And I imagine you also do your pre-work. So you know where people are in the room and who's going to be the hot button and who's going to be cold on the issue, and you can
Yeah.
adjust the temperature based on that, right?
That's absolutely right. I think, in my profession, driving transformations, driving changes, stakeholder management is one of the biggest, role I have. And stakeholder management is often seen, particularly in the chain space, as a negative thing. I've seen people, presume as like, oh my gosh, stakeholders are pain. I actually see it very differently. I think with stakeholders, they also have their stakeholders, and then they're managing their expectations. So there is something beyond, and it needs to be unraveled, because we understand like what are they catering for. It just gives you a different perspective. So for me, I think trying to manage stakeholder, most of it actually happens outside the room. You manage them outside and then you bring them together. I think you get better alignment. So
Yeah. Hardeep, let's explore that stakeholder management with the hardware software piece.
okay.
If we could, just let's brainstorm. I'd love your perspectives from a transformation and change management perspective on that. Often when we have KPIs or measures, right, that metrics that we do, the soft ones usually get shortchanged.
Yes.
Hard ones are easy. We know what they are. We know that they're bottom line oriented. Talk to us about, have you found soft, and by the way, I also say, because we're using the metaphor of software and hardware, often these skills end up getting put in a box of soft skills. And I always say soft skills are actually the hard skills.
Yes, I agree.
So how do we all, I think, have ways to measure that? I'm curious what your experience has been in measuring that, and to really then use that with, especially upline, right, with executives, to say, here's the impact of
Mhm.
how this is going. There's the adoption curve and all of that that plays in when you're doing change. So yeah, you can go anywhere with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I would say, many other, sectors and industries, we are also trying to figure that out, right? Because it's not that easy. Dollars, values, time, all of that, those things are easy to measure. But when you're talking about behavioral changes, it is very difficult. However, I think there are KPIs that are associated with adoption. So we've started to look at adoption data. But the direct connection to me, if you are not necessarily involving people, or not necessarily, treating people correctly, or if you're not bringing them along the journey, it is absolutely going to lead to rework. It is absolutely going to lead to delays. It's absolutely going to lead to the pain that you are actually going to be, kind of, experiencing when it's not installed correctly. Now, I would say in the past, all of those data points have been extremely hard to collect and measure. Actually now it's not that difficult, with all of these sort of, I would say, unstructured data that's available through Microsoft graphs and through sentiment data. We can actually do a lot more to understand where people are in that journey, and exclusion or inclusion of them can really impact your project in the adoption space, right? So if you are thinking of, I want to get to adoption in X amount of months, you are going to get delayed if people are not on board. I mean, just that data itself is extremely powerful. And to me, if I'm thinking of transformation, it really is an interplay between process, technology, and people. You take one of those things out, you're not going to be able to drive transformation. And it is so much better to bring the software of the culture along as you're trying to, really transform the organization. So I think luckily I've been able to really drive that, particularly in my work environment, the importance of both, right? Otherwise, we have so many data points where we fall into the 70% of the failure. Do you want to be in the 70%, or do you want to be in 30% who are successful? So setting the stage is really, really important.
Yep, absolutely. So in my experience, the people metrics are the hardest to get executives to really buy into. We usually have them, but
Mhm.
if you're willing, I'd love to hear, what have you found are the real golden nuggets that really do get the attention around, because what you're naming is productivity loss, time,
Mhm.
resource loss, right? When you have that rework, et cetera. So I'm curious what's worked for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the largest one is, or the most common one is the adoption metrics. I think one of the challenges that, sometimes is like no one has the patience to wait that long, right, for adoption. I think we're all just running from project to project, and the ROI is also kind of like, hey, we've ended, we've installed, and let's move on to something different. So while the data is a challenge, the metrics is a challenge, also our attention span, because we moved on to something else. So I think that's more of a bigger barrier than the actual metrics itself. The second barrier I also see is the celebration too early, So installations complete, you've gotten a little bit of a spike in performance or maybe a dip in performance, and people have moved on. So I am not really sure if data is an issue. I think it's some behavioral issues in ourselves in terms of attention spans, in terms of seeing it through. For financial gains, it's very readily available. It's literally your next cycle or the cycle after. And some of these take a little bit longer. And part of it is just that as well. I don't think so. We don't have time and patience, and we're just kind of like moving right along. But to answer your question, adoption metrics is one of them. And then we connect our adoption metrics to many other metrics, which are readily, again, available and easily measured.
Yeah, thanks. I agree. And across the adoption curve, right, I've also seen the tendency to gravitate, towards the early adopters and really celebrate them and almost agree to give up on the laggards.
Yeah.
And again, with that attention span and, you move on to the next thing, often those laggards just never get attention. And
Yeah.
of course, the peak folks are the ones that will really give you the peaks in the adoption numbers. I'm
Right.
curious about your perspectives on that. I mean, and please challenge me if you disagree that, there is
Yeah.
that compare and contrast of early adopters and laggards.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because if I do any change, I kind of divide the population into three different sections. You will always get the people who are going to adopt early, so that's early adopters, and then you'll have the people on the other side of the fence, almost like a bell curve, right? So they will never get on board. And my encouragement to all my leadership team is not even focus on those because you'll never get on board, and that's waste. However, in the middle of the bell curve, you have people who are just kind of, watch, right? Sit and watch. If we can get some conversion there. But the idea for adoption is not necessarily looking for 100% adoption because that may never be achieved. It's looking for what is the critical mass that you need to get to say, yes, you've done the adoption. And the rest, I think it's the matter of time. Because over a period of time, I think your culture or your hardware starts to shift, whether it's your processes or your information flow, and then people will have no choice, right? They will adopt to it. So it's really, understanding what that critical mass looks like and not necessarily to focus on that 5% or 2% because you're never going to get them there. And that's a waste of effort.
Yeah, I agree that that's very standard. All of us, I think, practice that. But since we're talking about respect, I'm wondering what you found. Again, I think those early adopters get a lot of attention, and
Mhm.
they like being in the limelight, and they get showcased with personas and maybe even road shows with a launch and all that. Uh, but on the other side, if most of us do choose to not pay attention to the laggards, I'm wondering if you've experienced any impact on respect, because especially, I mean, like looking at generational things, if we're going to make assumptions and stereotypes around technology adoption with, folks that are more senior and have, are maybe close to retirement and assume that they're not going to be tech adopters, there's an impact to that, right, on influence and adoption across, even though they're not our target to get them on board.
Yeah. No, I agree, right? So I think, if you're falling into that category that, adoption because of your capabilities or because of your competencies is not going to happen, I think we still need to seek to understand the real reason, right? And be respectful around it. And I recall we were on a project and I was actually the project was simple, like electronic forms. Like, we won't have any paper forms anymore. And I think we were just switching everything, our procedures into electronic iPads. And was that difficult? Absolutely, it was difficult. What we found was, for those population, we had to do extra, capability builds, right? So we send them to like, some basic, skills, right, around computer usage. And this was, I'm talking 20, 30 years ago. So now everyone's computer savvy at least, right? So I think the companies need to just pause and understand that if you're trying to switch, right, and you're trying to, for example, AI is going to be in the same boat. Not everybody's going to be, very competent in prompt engineering from the very beginning. So they need to be step ahead and thinking about building the competencies and the talent which will actually feed into the next era, if you will. So respect in there shows up is really understanding what can actually be done to remove those barriers, right? What can be done to really make sure they're comfortable. Now, if the company has done all of that and people are still resisting, then we have a different type of problem. But respect to me is seeking to understand, like, what are their blockers, right? What are the barriers?
Yeah, I love that. Are the seeking to understand. So one other angle on that, and then we'll get to closing, is I find often with change or just about any leadership communication, when you do metrics, employee surveys, etc., internal communication is always one of the lowest,
Sure.
right? There's just, and executives always say, but we told them, we did the memo, we did the all hands. If we layer that with your space of transformational change and the change curve from a place of respect, and actually, yeah, let's transition this into your tips for
Mm,
our audience around
mm,
what can we do to do that in a way that meets business needs and that human-centric need,
yeah,
because often that communication means saying that, yes, we're openly saying we're not going to address what you said, here's why.
yeah,
That usually doesn't happen, right? There's a good job in selling the pitch for what direction a strategy is going in, but not the naysayers on why we're not going with the way
yeah,
some input we receive. To me, that's a form of respect, is to be that level, to have that level of transparency, assuming you can do it legally and with governance and all that. To
yeah.
the extent that you can speak to that, I think is really important. I'd love your perspective from the industry you've been in on that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the magic word is being transparent, right? So I think human mind is just interesting, right? If we don't have information, we fill it up. We just create our own narrative in our heads. And most of the time, and these larger strategic initiatives happen, we clearly focus on the opportunities that it's going to bring. And absolutely, it is tied to a larger strategy, and there are opportunities. However, we will never have all the answers, and it's just impossible because sometimes where you are in their journey. I think to me, being transparent is very, very critical in the journey, right? There are times that you will not have information and you can just say, I don't have that information and I don't have it now. However, I will get it to you when I have it. Now, looping back is what will gain the respect and the trust. Oftentimes, that's forgotten, right? So I think that then it becomes more of a lip service that I'll get it to you, and a month goes by and the person is still waiting. So little things that can be done, to gain that trust and drive that transparency and being consistent, right? And being consistent and being disciplined about it is extremely helpful. I think on the flip side, when you talk about communication, what still baffles me is the way we consume information outside of work is extremely different than the way we consume information inside work. And I was actually just on, this project that I'm working on, and I've started to think about it. It's like, it's not that automatically when you open up your work laptop, like everything changes. You're still the same person. I wonder if you can start thinking about communications in a little bit different way, and it's just not one way, it's not through email. So we shall see where all this is progressing, but I feel like my response to your question around transparency around communication is like it needs to be coming from the place of really ensuring that people have the right information and relevant information for them to do their job, right? And that's the role of the leader. Um, and
Yeah.
not
No, that's it. And the piece around, the looping back, I always like to remind the more senior they are, the more important this is with power differential comes the responsibility to take ownership for your accountability. It's
correct.
very easy for an executive to ask and expect deliverables, but especially in these areas of concern and communication gaps, to close that loop with, I'm going to get back to you, and then actually, and put a date on it and then actually do it or let them know by when, is just as critical as people that are junior to you. All right, Hardeep. So please share, I'd say 1 to 3 tips with our audience on how to bring more respect into the space of transformation and change management that lots of people who are going to be listening, I imagine, either do this directly or in some way all of us get involved with change and adoption curves. So yeah, over to you for our closing comments.
Yeah, and I what 3 things I would share is to be relentlessly curious, right? To me, that if you're curious, you're coming from the place in the second point, which is more around, being extremely respectful. And also, the third point would be, seeking to understand. Listen, don't listen to respond, listen to understand. I think majority of the time you're listening just to like, okay, how am I going to respond to that answer versus listening to understand. Seeking clarity is another one because we all are a product of our experiences, right? So, and don't jump to conclusion, don't make assumptions, treat people respectfully in all of those, sort of environment, and listen actively to what the other person is saying. So.
Wonderful, Hardeep. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all your insights. I just know that the global audience that's going to watch this and hear from you is going to learn a lot. Deeply appreciate your guidance. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Bobby.